John DeCuria. It was in 1984 at Genoa. I'm pastor of Sacred Heart Church, Lewistown, and St. Jude Church, Mifflintown. Very happy to be with you. Evangelii Gaudium. Evangelii Gaudium. The joy of the gospel. We've been getting talks on this apostolic exhortation of Pope Francis, and in which he's talking about what he calls the missionary option of the church. Also, he calls it, I think more appropriately, the missionary impulse of the church, that we are to exemplify that joy of the good news of Jesus Christ, risen from the dead, for our salvation. We're to go out, feel that impulse to go out and share that, especially with the poor. Especially with the poor. And just some highlights what you've gotten already in past talks on this before we get into the subject matter at hand. He says the Lord takes the initiative in evangelization. And that's good to hear that. You should relax with that a little bit. That there's work to do, but God takes the initiative. It's really God's work, and not primarily our work. He says, and some of these phrases are memorable. People are talking about some of the things that he says out of this document, like the evangelizer must take on the smell of the sheep. You are the shepherd, and you have to really be mingling with the sheep such that you take on their smell. Joy, 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 joy. I mean, he can't say it enough. It's all about joy, the joy of the gospel, and we are supposed to be reflecting that joy at all times. He says that, he talks about the parish. The parish is the church living in the midst of the homes of her sons and daughters. It is a center for evangelization. The parish is supposed to be where we are to preach Christ, direct relationship with Jesus Christ. Not just doctrine, not just moral law, but relationship with Jesus. And our joy is supposed to reflect to the world, to others, our basic friendship and relationship with a person. With a person, not with a body of laws and regulations. We can express truths in a more vibrant way, he says. I like this one under a category called A Mother with an Open Heart. I'm going to quote this directly. This is, maybe you've heard this already, and as a pastor I kind of relate to this. He says, you don't have to be rushing about, but often it is better simply to slow down, to put aside our eagerness in order to see and listen to others, to stop rushing from one thing to another, and to remain with someone who has faltered along the way. At times we have to be like the father of the prodigal son, who always kept his door open, so that when the son returns, he can readily pass through it. Isn't that beautiful, just to be that open door as church and inviting people in this missionary impulse. We have to go forth to everyone, but especially to the poor. He says, I prefer a church that is bruised, hurting, and dirty, because it has been out on the streets, rather than a church that is unhealthy, from being confined and clinging to its own security. And he talks about the idolatry of money. A lot of people are quoting that. He has been critical of the trickle-down theory that if you go for the gold, go for wealth, and you really work hard to get rich, that'll trickle down to the poor. He says it doesn't work. And he says, the worship of the ancient golden calf has returned in a new and ruthless guise, in the idolatry of money and the dictatorship of an impersonal economy lacking a truly human purpose. He says, money must serve, not rule. Money must serve, not rule. Now, right now we're going to get into the subject matter at hand, and this section is entitled Temptations Faced by Pastoral Workers. Temptations faced by pastoral workers. You could also call them sort of errors that we can fall into, mistakes that can be made. He goes a little bit into a scold mold here, I think. But just wags his finger a little bit. Maybe that's good for us. Maybe that's healthy for us to wake up as priests and parishioners and parish leaders. The first thing he does in this section, however, is to express gratitude for the work that is being done. He is deeply grateful to all pastoral workers, despite the scandals that have happened. He says, I'm very grateful for what you are doing. And he says, for the beautiful example, quote, given to me by so many Christians who joyfully sacrifice their lives and their time. This witness comforts and sustains me in my own effort to overcome selfishness and to give more fully of myself, unquote. What a thing for a pope to say. I'm sinful, he says. I am selfish as well. And to see the dedication of so many pastoral workers out there, priests and laity, helps me to battle my own selfishness and sinfulness and gives me the inspiration to do that. But he says, let's go on now. He says, let's call attention to certain temptations that can happen to pastoral workers. He says, under a subcategory entitled Yes to the Challenge of a Mission Spirituality. Yes to the challenge of a mission spirituality. He says there are three evils that fuel one another in pastoral work. Number one, a heightened individualism. Number two, a crisis of identity. Number three, a cooling of fervor. He says that because of skepticism with regard to the church's mission, especially in the media, where we encounter a lot of skepticism about the church and about her teachings, as a result, pastoral workers can fall into a sort of inferiority complex, he says. We can wind up being unhappy with who we are and what we do. Evangelization for such pastoral workers thus becomes sort of forced. We sort of buy into the skepticism that is around us in our general culture. Don't do that, he says. He says these pastoral workers fall into a kind of relativism, acting as if God did not exist. Relativism is the error that says all things are relative. There is no absolute truth. Depends on the situation. Such pastoral workers falling into a kind of relativism or acting like that can also fall into material comfort. He says we have to say no to selfishness and spiritual sloth. Sloth is laziness. And he says, and I really like, as a pastor, I like this quote. He says, at a time when we most need a missionary dynamism that will bring salt and light to the world, many lay people fear that they may be asked to undertake some apostolic work, and they seek to avoid any responsibility that may take away their free time. For example, it has become very difficult today to find trained parish catechists willing to persevere in this work for some years, unquote. Yay, yes, thank you, Holy Father. Right now I'm trying to get CCD teachers in my one parish. So if you have to be a CCD teacher, say yes. And I had a couple people, I'm on the phone begging people to, and I shouldn't judge, but, a couple of them I think would have been very fine CCD teachers, very relatively young people, say, no, not my thing, or no, got to know my own limits, Father. And it's a real groaner for me, so I just love that quote from the Pope, where he even gives the example of trying to get parish catechists, religion teachers, hard to do. Something similar with priests can happen, obsessed with protecting their free time, the Pope says. So rattling my cage a little bit, and that's good. Evangelization, for them, he says, becomes, for these types of priests, protecting their free time, evangelization becomes a kind of poison. These priests fall into a sort of acedia, That's a fancy name for, well, sloth, spiritual laziness. They may work, actually, he said, this is kind of paradoxical, kind of a contradiction, but he says it can take the form of actually working very hard, but at the wrong kinds of things, or working hard, demanding immediate results. Let us not, he says, allow ourselves to be robbed of the joy of evangelization. We have to say no to a sterile pessimism. The evils of our age that are all around us actually can be used as sort of an instrument or a tool to prompt us to grow. Remembering Paul says in Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 5, verse 20, where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. Where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. You can't beat grace. You cannot beat grace. So don't be discouraged by the evils of the age that are all around you. The Pope says that prompt you to greater fervor and more vibrant action. We march on, confident of victory. As Paul says again in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9, where God is speaking to Paul, saying, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. That's when he was complaining about the thorn in the flesh. God tells him, whatever that thorn in the flesh was of Paul, we don't know what it was. He doesn't say. Some sort of weakness or temptation or difficulty. God says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. He doesn't take away the thorn in the flesh. And I remember Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane too says, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but yours be done. And Jesus had to drink deeply from the cup anyway. So evils of the age and difficulties are not necessarily going to go away, but grace abounds all the more. Pope says some societies are trying to build themselves without God and forming a kind of a spiritual desert in public life. Ain't that true in the Western world, in the United States of America, and also in traditionally Catholic countries? Isn't that a shame? France and Italy and Scandinavian countries trying to push God out of public life. From this desert, this kind of spiritual desert, he says we can rediscover the value of what is essential for living. And we see evidence of the thirst for God, and you and I are living sources of that water. I think of the Samaritan woman at the well, where Jesus says, I have water of which you do not know, from which you will drink and never be thirsty again. You and I are supposed to be that well, that fountain. So we have to say yes to the new relationships brought by Christ. He talks about new modes of communication, that social media being great promise of connecting with one another. Just read an article in the newspaper about that this morning, about the new connectivity, and the author said, it is here to stay. He says, when I was growing up, the author said, I don't know how old this writer is, maybe about my age, I'm not really sure, but he said, we tried to limit our kids' TV time and radio time and take those earbuds out and go out and play. And the article actually said, the author actually said, forget about it now, you can't do that. I mean, it's just so pervasive that we just have to channel it and strategize and be creative about how this new connectivity is done, because we're immersed in it. But the Pope says something different here, a little bit different. He says, quote, the gospel tells us constantly to run the risk of a face-to-face encounter with others, with their physical presence, which challenges us with their pain and with their pleas. So that face-to-face encounter, make a friend, be a friend, bring a friend to Christ, as we say in Cursillo, is very important. He says our challenge today is not so much atheism, quote, as the need to respond adequately to many people's thirst for God, unquote, lest they satisfy it by the wrong avenues, like the cults. I just saw the movie God Is Not Dead, and I don't want to give too much away. It's still playing in Colonial Park, I believe, but the sort of mean atheist in that movie did really have kind of a thirst for God. He was wounded by an event in his life, that made him very aggressively atheistic. And I don't know if that's always true. It's a fictional movie, the characters are fictional, but this guy was very hurt by something, by a tragedy in his life that seemed to be fueling his atheism. That seems to be what the Pope is talking about. This thirst for God sometimes can be answered, the Pope says, by genuine popular religion can help satisfy that longing, providing a connection with Christ, Mary, and the saints. We need to find Jesus in the face of others, in their voices, in their pleas. We have to find God in one another, of putting up with the ups and downs of life, of loving one another. Let us not allow ourselves to be robbed of community. We need that community, that face-to-face community, the Pope says. Have to say no to spiritual worldliness. And here he goes into a thing, something like a piety talk on the Cursillo weekend, where we talk about the mechanical mites and the pharisaical fills and the holy Hannahs, and the Pope seems to go into a thing like that here. And he says there's a type of worldliness that can pervade in the church that hides behind the appearances of piety, even in love for the church, but it consists in seeking not the Lord's glory, but human glory and personal well-being, like a lot of those negative characters in the piety talk. That's what it reminds me of. It's what the Lord, he says, reprimanded the Pharisees for. This worldliness that can take over pastoral workers, pastors, priests, and laity is not always linked to outward sin necessarily, because it's geared to appearances, and this is very carefully done by the practitioners to look good. He says it's evident in two ways. Some big words here. I'll try to help you through them. Number one, a neo-Gnosticism, and number two, a neo-Pelagianism, naming two ancient heresies that sort of recycle themselves throughout time perennially. Gnosticism comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. So it's secret knowledge. So this kind of worldliness in neo-Gnosticism, a certain experience or a set of ideas meant to console or enlighten, but keeping one imprisoned in his or her own thoughts. Neo-Pelagianism, from the fellow who perpetrated it back around the 4th, 5th century, Pelagius. St. Augustine of Hippo was one of his great enemies. Pelagianism is a works righteousness, to keep it simple, sort of a works righteousness. I'm getting to heaven on my own, without grace. And this worldliness can show as sort of a neo-Pelagianism, feeling superior to others by virtue of obeying certain rules. Here, a supposed soundness of doctrine or discipline leads to a certain narcissism, an authoritarian elitism. No real evangelization here. I read this stuff and I wonder, who's he talking about? And he never names, who he's talking about, but it must be, I'm just thinking certain groups or movements or certain areas of the church, so we're left to guess. Is it me? Look in the mirror, know thyself. I think that's what he's trying to do. Is it you? Is it me? Certain groups, but no real evangelization here. In others, this neo-Pelagianism, feeling superior to others by virtue of obeying certain rules, takes the form of a preoccupation with the liturgy. We should respect the liturgy, but for some maybe it goes too far, without any concern that the gospel have a real impact on God's faithful people. Church turns into a museum. We have to be careful. I know I have to be careful. I don't think I am, but be careful being the sacristy priest. The sacristy priest, just polishing candlesticks, and making sure the vestments are in order, and just there's a legitimate love for the liturgy, definitely, but the liturgy have to prompt us out into the street. That's what the Pope is saying. I always thinking about that. The correspondence, the connection between the sanctuary and the street. And there should be a symbiotic relationship between the two. And yet others, the spiritual worldliness is a fascination with political gain or pride in management. a desire to be seen, a business mentality on the part of priests or parishioners. No effort is made to go forth and seek out those who are distant. We avoid these things by building a church. We avoid these things by building a church going out from ourselves and keeping her mission focused on Jesus Christ and commitment to the poor. We cannot be warring. Another subsection here is no warring among ourselves. We can't be fighting with one another. Christians can wind up, the Pope says, battling one another between countries or between parishes or within parishes. He says, I quote, I especially ask Christians and communities throughout the world to offer a radiant and attractive witness of fraternal communion. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another, quoting John 13:35. Beware of the temptation of jealousy. I'm quoting him again here. He says, we all have our likes and dislikes, and perhaps at this very moment we are angry with someone. At least let us say to the Lord, Lord, I am angry with this person, with that person. I pray to you for him, for her. Unquote. That is a very beautiful thing, very down-to-earth thing. He says, to pray for a person with whom I am irritated is a beautiful step forward in love and an act of evangelization. Let us do it today. Let us not allow ourselves to be robbed of the ideal of fraternal love. Other ecclesial challenges. Many lay people have a deeply rooted sense of community, but we need them to be more involved in conveying gospel values to the political, economic, and social sphere, to transform society, changing environments. Big rallying cry of the Cursillo movement, to change our environments. That's what the Pope is saying here, just right resonant with the Cursillo movement. He says women are making a tremendous contribution to the church through the sensitivity, intuition, and other distinctive skill sets that they have. More than men, they tend to possess. More than men, he says. He does say this, quote, the reservation of the priesthood to males as a sign of Christ, the spouse, who gives himself in the Eucharist, is not a question open to discussion. So it comes down solid on male priesthood, but to utilize the gifts of women and to remember, he says, the priesthood is an office of service, not of lording it over others. The ministerial priesthood is ordered to the holiness of its members, and it's not just an authoritarian thing. He says, challenges exist to be overcome. All these challenges, temptations in the pastoral work that can fall to us. Let us be, I'm quoting, realists, but without losing our joy, our boldness, and our hope-filled commitment. Let us not allow ourselves to be robbed of missionary vigor. Thank you, Lord.